landscape has changed very much over time in Wales. My name is Ed Price. I'm one of the assistant directors in the EAS with oversight of governance, but also oversight of all of our data teams as well. So I have done the data training for a number of years for the region and in local authorities. Before that, I'm an IT teacher in the past as well, so always been interested in numbers and data. So by the end of this session, it's an awareness of the roles of the responsibilities. It's an understanding of the role that assessment plays in school and recognizing that it's not just one set of numbers that matter. It's a broad range of data that you need in school, and there's more flexibility than ever on the data that is used in school. It's that awareness, the third bullet point, of how data is significantly changing. But I will talk a little bit about the past, even though many of you are new governors, so you understand some of the history of it, when it might be available and how to access it, although it is not necessarily the same in every school. Okay. And awareness as well that other parties, local authorities, Welsh Government, ourselves may well use data, and some towards the end of the tools that may be useful. I won't necessarily go through this in this order. The one key thing to think about throughout this is you are new governors, you are volunteers, you are not going to be data analysts or people who are analysing the data, and you're not expected to be an expert in any way. You're likely to have more questions and are encouraged to develop everything. And the one line I would say, and I said it the other night, to several of you who are in the induction session, is be inquisitive as governors. That's the key to everything. And asking questions about the data is one of the key ways for doing it. So what I want to talk about in terms of the order is an introduction, rationale. The governor's role will be a little bit later. I want to start with some of the history of assessment in Wales and what you need to know to reference back to as well. There's been a lot of change from 2018. I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but you do need to understand some of the context of that, because huge amounts of it was planned changes to accountability in our system anyway, and it was accelerated by the COVID pandemic and the use of data in primary schools in particular. There's also, in parallel to this, curriculum for Wales and changes to the curriculum, which gives much more flexibility to schools. So you can't have schools assessing in consistent ways that you used to have in the past. And then finally, the school class level data available. Underpinning all of that, and I'll return to this quite a bit, is it is about now individual learner progression and supporting that individual learning progression at the pace that's right for them, rather than having to reach artificial targets that might not have been suitable for those individual learners. So at this stage, in the chat, I can cut it out if people want to put their hand up and unmute as well. But any questions at this stage? I will continue in a minute, but if questions come in, I'll try and keep an eye on the chat and answer them for you. Okay, so by all means type them in or pop hands up. I don't mind. About every 6 or 7 slides, by the way, I will stop and do the same and say any questions. Okay, so it's not your final chance to answer any questions, and I'll do them in the chat. So changes from 2018 onwards to foundation phase, key stage 2, which are the 2 stages that they were known by then in our primary schools. Basically, foundation phase age 7, key stage 2 age 11, and the assessments that were done. It's the same changes at key stage 3, which is into our secondary schools at age 14, but I covered that in our secondary session instead. If, by the way, you're a governor in a primary school and a secondary school, you only need to come on one of these sessions. So don't worry if you are in the wrong one as well. The primary one will cover you off pretty much at secondary as well. So a little bit of history. When did we start using data in schools? Before 1987, yes, there was data, but there was no nationally consistent data available in England and Wales. So bear in mind, this is pre-Welsh Assembly government, so England and Wales, the same system. But The people who brought this in, ultimately, really going back in history, Margaret Thatcher and her Education Secretary, Kenneth Baker, brought in statutory assessments in a range of areas, age 7, age 11, age 14. Statutory teacher assessment was used from 1991. And in Wales, standardised assessment tests, SATs as they were called, were used up till 1995 in primary, 1997 at Key Stage 3. It moved in Wales just to teacher assessment. In England, those still continue. Obviously, you got GCSEs, A levels, those still continue. But what happened in primary schools was over this period, particularly from the early 2000s, a range of data that was available from local authorities in standard packs, which compared for self-evaluation, but also accountability. And it became more and more about accountability, particularly from about 2010 onwards, where we were looking at benchmarking schools, comparisons, looking at trends. Estin used the data heavily to dictate their outcomes, not necessarily what they saw in books. So the data drove everything. But it's worth remembering this only started in 1987. Before then, there was nothing consistent. These are examples of some of the packs. The one on the left was an EAS one. That's our old logos, which was based on packs from local authorities, which summarised the data in schools. They were generally welcomed by school leaders at the time because it saved them doing much of the number crunching and producing that data. They were then, from about 2010, supported by the packs that you see on the right, which were called the All Wales Core Data Set, brought in by the Minister then, Leighton Andrews, who wanted to increase accountability in schools ultimately. Those packs were about 100 pages long. I always worry when you look at a pack and the index page is 8 pages long. So they were voluminous in what they produced. They are no longer available. They have returned at Key Stage 4 for GCSE, but they're not returned and they're not returning at primary. But I wanted to tell you briefly what was in them. Assessing in foundation phase, the then subjects of language, literacy, communication, mathematical development, and I'll call it PSD rather than the full title, but personal social development. But then at Key Stage 2, in English or Welsh, maths, science, it says and or because Welsh medium schools would have to assess in both at age 11. What would then happen is that all those scores for those, so this is an example of year 6 learners when they left primary school, would be aggregated together. And if you had 30 learners, the percentage would be worked out and charts would be seen to see where you were. So I can tell this primary school back in 2009, the blue line, 70% of learners achieved the level 4. Now, the level 4 was originally, when it came in, became called the expected level. So you were expecting your average learner to achieve a level 4 or above. Now, you can see here, this school has got 70% of back in those 7 years ago achieving. It has gone upwards. It's gone upwards on quite a jagged journey, up and down, because you only have 30 maximum, I would say 60 learners in each cohort. If you have a look at some of the other lines, there's this thing called a family. That is just 10 similar schools. I won't go into the detail of that. This school generally above the family most of the time, so they're similar schools. But you've also got the lines for Wales and the local authority, which in this instance are incredibly similar. Does anyone in the chat, if you want, while I continue talking, want to say something about what they notice about those black and red lines from 80% back in 2019 and what's happened to them? If anyone wants to say, feel free, or even, raise your hand and we'll unmute and we'll cut that bit out. But those lines have generally gone upwards, haven't they? So in that 7-year period, the average learner, or the percentage of learners who are achieving that level 4 in Wales, has gone up from 80 to 90%, driven by schools making sure that learners could demonstrate that they could get that level. However, anyone want to say what would happen in another 7 years' time? Or, even more complicated, another 8 years' time? If we continued at the same rate? Any thoughts on it? Okay. what would happen? 7 years' time, you would be at 100%. 8 years' time, you've got nowhere to go, and you cannot go any higher because you can't have more than 30 of your 30 learners achieving. Plus, we have many learners in Wales, a reduced number, who cannot achieve those levels because of complex special needs, etc. But the targets were driving things inexorably upwards, and they weren't necessarily the best thing for the learner, is what I would say in that system, because it was driven by accountability, not supporting learner progress and the right thing to do for that learner. Also, you're assessing learners all at the same time, where we know that learners progress at different rates in their schools and in the careers as school journeys as well. So that's the last graph I'll show you. Okay, but any questions, happy to take them in the chat on assessment in the past. And also, what do you understand about this main assessment, the focus being in the past? And I will cut this section out of the recording if anyone wants to ask any questions. Just pop your hand up. Changes continued. So what Welsh Government did in 2018, so this isn't about COVID, this is before COVID, saying teacher assessment used for information purposes only, not about accountability, and the pack stopped. So they stopped providing those packs. No change to the collection process, although there has been since, and data was still shared, but they stopped producing the packs in 2018 for primary schools. Sorry, don't mean more questions. What also happened was they changed then, the regulations, and this is where COVID comes in. They couldn't assess learners because in 2020, the summer when they'd be assessed, learners wouldn't have been in. So they stopped then collecting the assessments. Notice that the collection of assessments was actually hard coded into the law in Wales. They actually brought a law in, the School Performance Information Wales regulation in 2011, to say that schools had to provide this assessment data. There was nothing before to actually make schools submit that assessment data to the responsibility of the governing body to what Welsh Government, so it could then be passed on to consortia and local authorities. What also stopped was end of foundation phase assessment and end of key stage 2 assessments. And this will help in a little while to answer your question. The middle one is an important one. It would be for individual schools to determine how to best to meet the needs of their learners to support progression. This should be led by the 6 key principles of assessment, which I will cover in a minute, and we'll look at them later in the session. So any questions at this stage or comments, I'm happy to take them as well. In the chat, I will go back to them if you add them in. So your role, and I've added the word in revised role here. It is, and it continues to be, about making and asking informed questions regarding the data in schools, but you don't have that comparative data there as well. It's much more about how the schools assesses, what that assessment data tells them, and what it then can tell you. But you don't have those charts that you did in the past. It's ensuring that data is analysed by the school leadership and presented to the governing body, but it's not in the ways it was in the past. It is, however, about being clear about strengths and areas for development. So differences between different subjects areas, different areas of the curriculum, what personalised assessments, and I'll come on to those later, tell you as well. Being able to look at the school's data and collectively analysing and looking at the data, not analysing, asking questions about it, because it's for school leadership to analyse it, not you. However, we know that there may well be governors who are really interested in data who will love to sit on the assessment committee or standards committee or performance committee or whatever you call it in your school in governing body organisation, who will be able to bring something to the table and help. The one key thing I think as well is ensuring that the school development plan, and I talked about the school development plan briefly on induction, is the document by which the school plans its improvement. But do the priorities in it actually reflect previous performance? The glib example, in a way, or simplistic example, is if boys writing is your issue, is boys writing development a key part of the school development plan? If oracy, when learners enter school, is something that data is telling you is an issue, is development of oracy part of your development plan? Why wouldn't it be in any industry, business, organization? Be the data tells you something where you need to look and improve, and that's what it should be about. Okay, and then monitoring progress against the school development plan using that data presented by school leadership. So curriculum for Wales. I said that curriculum for Wales was a key element of it and a key driver of these changes as well. What curriculum for Wales does is give flexibility to schools on what's taught, how it's taught, when it's taught. So consistent assessment not possible. But what they say, the link is there in this presentation to the guidance on the framework and accountability, but some key points. In using data, schools, that means governing bodies as well, LAs, regional consortia should use a balanced approach, draws on a range of qualitative and quantitative. I use the phrase summative and formative. I know they're not directly aligned, but data that's about the learner and helping them progress, and data that gives us state of where we are on individual schools' needs, although there should be commonalities. Now, the one big commonality is the cluster, because all your learners in all your primary schools in the main are going to one secondary school. So that secondary school does need to understand how primary schools are assessing. What used to happen in the past, and yes, it was more than this, but schools, secondary schools would get a list of learners and they had a level 4 in science, a level 4 in English, a level 5 in maths, and they would have those lists of quantitative data, but did they really tell them enough about the school? So it's about that dialogue as well. So it's not solely relying on those narrow measures. It's making sure that it's meaningful for school leaders as well. It's not just data for the sake of it, as that third point. So for schools, it's use the information, wide range of information, develop those lines of inquiry to spur the self-evaluation. In other words, data gives you permission to ask questions, doesn't necessarily give you answers, but that self-evaluation, improvement planning, that's what the data's for. Using information for self-evaluation on your own context as well, and considering carefully comparative information, although that is far less available than it ever was. So holding your own, using your own data for self-evaluation in schools as well. As part of that, assessment and support, its use in supporting learner assessment, learner progression is essential. There is a guide there as well. I put the link. The link is in the PowerPoint if you want to get it, but if you Google assessment supporting learning progression, it is there, and there is guidance on it from Welsh Government. I will zoom in to that dartboard, for want of a better word, with 6 principles, and these are the 6 key principles that I mentioned earlier. I'll start at 1 o'clock. Well, it's 12 o'clock on the actual zone in the dartboard, but it's 1 o'clock on the label I've put on it. It's back to the cluster. It's about progression from when learners enter school to when they leave school, and the type of school doesn't matter. And it needs our schools to work better together. It needs you as governing bodies to work better as well. And you're thinking, when did you last work together? When did you last meet your secondary school governing body as primary governors? When did you meet your other primary school governing bodies as well? Or do you just leave it all to school leadership? It's about learners at the heart of it. So supporting active learners in the assessment process. It's making it an ongoing process. We used to, yes, schools would assess their learners all the way through, but the big assessments came age 7 and 11. Well, age 11, the data came out when the learners had actually moved up to secondary school. So it was a backward look at what we did, not necessarily about those learners then. It was not, it was about, it wouldn't have impacted on the learners in your care because they had moved up, if that makes sense. So it's about as well that assessment informs what you do. So assessment should be about informing what the next stages of your curriculum development are. What are the children learning? Are they learning? Are they benefiting from it? Are they making progress? If not, you don't carry on doing the same thing. Your assessment tells you to go, right, we need to reflect on this. We need to work on this. We need to change it. The fifth principle is that there should be breadth. It was all about these end of stage assessments rather than using, and yes, schools did this, but the big issue was this end of stage assessment, which took away from the others. Schools have now got more flexibility to do what they want to do in terms of observing learners, using their own shorter term, more frequent assessments to see where learners are, assessing classwork more often to see where learners are. And then the final bit is engagement with parents and carers as well. I'm sure many of you on the screen are parents, and you may see reports come home that, well, I remember from one of mine from my eldest daughter, who's now 25 in a school in a school that, in a region that doesn't exist anymore. But she had a report that came back that said that this is at secondary now, that she had a level 6 in English, 58% in maths, I think it was higher, and an A grade in English. I'm going, what does this mean? They weren't consistent. They weren't relevant. There were no descriptors on there. You want to know how well your child is progressing, not these artificial numbers that are attached to them. The numbers almost gave us a sense of comfort in the past. So engagement is key. Also, you need meaningful written reports as well, is absolutely key, and you need dialogue just as much to have the right approach at parents' evenings. So this is a summary really, but from the guidance, moving away from those nationally required, well, we have moved away. For school settings to develop, when I say settings, by the way, it's nursery settings in the main, are best placed to design their own assessment arrangements, but should be on a cluster basis. It's got to be linked to curriculum for Wales to support individual learner progression. It's got to be a continuum of 3 to 16. It's removing those summative end of phase assessments so that it's forward looking, not backward looking, building on prior learning. And what is going on and has been going on for a number of years now with other colleagues of mine on the other side of the service is us supporting school leaders, teachers, clusters to develop their arrangements through a range of groups and networks that are ongoing. But there is no single answer out there, and it's still something that your leaders and colleagues in school are working through. Estin. So first word there, you will still have Estin inspections. Estin will still make assessments. They used to make assessments on what was called standards. Okay, and they would ask the questions of standards reached by pupils overall, the progress that learners made, trends in performance, particular groups of pupils, and variation between subjects. I won't dwell on that slide, but if you look at the slide of what Estin are looking at now, it is not hugely varied from that. They are still looking at what's known as learning. Okay, so you will still have those inspections. We still know that the thresholds for those assessments for those Estin inspections are still very, very rigorous. But what they are looking at is actually what's happening in the books of those learners. They're listening to them. They're listening to their speaking. They're looking at their writing. They're looking at their digital skills. They're looking at their numeracy and how well schools doing in terms of the standards pupils achieved, but also still by groups of learners. They're also looking, considering whether those groups of learners are making as much progress as they were. Those inspectors will also use in-school data, yeah, which I'll come on to in a minute, to give their judgments, and those are all publicly available, but they're not numbers, they're narrative judgments, but you've still got the categories that you will be aware of in the past, although Estin framework is changing slightly, but I can still see those being there. They look at groups of learners as well. There are only 4 really large groups of learners in most of our schools, boys or girls, free school meal, not eligible for free school meal. Those are the free school meal, not eligible for free school meal, a proxy indicator for socioeconomic deprivation ultimately. Some people balk and hate the term. They do not and ever have meant that learners with free school meals are limited in what they can achieve, but what they do mean, they are just used as an indicator for the range of socioeconomic disadvantage in the school. And we do know that statistically, schools with higher proportions do less well in terms of those learners. We know that those learners do less well as well. We're also looking at pupils with ALN and the range there. I've got a few acronyms on here that I really need to sort out, but additional learning needs, special educational needs as a component of that, more able and talented as a component of that. EAL is English as an additional language, and LAC is looked after children. In the induction guidance booklet, you've got a list of acronyms. It's about a few pages long, but that's on our website as well. Beware though that where the groups are small, you really need caution in analysing them. You know, if you have one looked after learner who achieves one year, doesn't the next, you know, it can very often be down to the individual learner. And as governors, you are certainly not entitled to see data on individual learners because of GDPR and their individual rights. It's only those who need to know. You should be seeing summaries of the data for those groups. This is where we may see more data available to you, and all schools are expected at least once a year to do personalised assessments. They were formerly known as national tests. They're not to be confused with the standardised tests of the past or the tests in England, but from year 2 to 9, they've been available for many years online since 2019. They used to have a comparative analysis, but the school will have access to data on them. They're adaptive. By adaptive, what I mean, I can just about see my hand with the background. The questions start off as a mid-range. If you struggle with that question, you get an easier question. If you struggle with that, you get easier questions. And you get easier questions until it finds your level. If you start getting them right again, you'll get more challenging questions. If you start off and you get challenging questions right and you find them too easy, the questions will get harder for you. It's so that no child has a negative experience of failing on loads and loads of questions because the range is not right for them. So they're adaptive. No particular assessment window, and they focus on what the learner can do, what they need to do, what the next steps are. So they're about narrative reports for the class teacher, for the school leaders, for about the individual learner as well. There is a linked on the website an introduction for parents carers on YouTube, which was worth a look. I think it's about a 6-7 minute video about personalized assessments, so that's helpful. It does provide feedback on year groups, and I think as governors, you know, the questions you're asking are, if you're new, well, when do we do personalised assessments in school? What have they told us? Have they told us about any particular year groups that need additional support or additional challenges in there? So there are questions there for you on those personalised assessments. And I know as a new governor, you may not be, you know, feeling asking about them, but I would be saying, right, when are they done? You know, oh, I've been on training. Could you tell me a little bit more about these? So those are available. In addition to those, I put an acronym warning on this one. There are a load of other diagnostic tests that are available at school level that are done in a way that's non-threatening to individual learners, that schools may use, usually purchase, very similar to the national test, but schools have a preference for many of them. There's some examples there. Those are just commercial firms that offer them that you may have heard of. Schools choose to use those. Oh, do we use anything else? What does that data tell us? The key thing is, what does that data tell us is the absolute key at a parental level, but at a governing body level as well. That's the key elements of data that are available, but there's also you know, the assessment that teachers make as well. I think as a governing body, you need to know, what's the quality of teaching like in school? In terms of, have school leaders got a handle on what the quality is like in the breadth of classrooms and what learning is like? As governors, the one thing I would encourage you to do, even as lay people, is if there's a learning walk, grab the opportunity. If there's book looks where you're looking in books, grab the opportunity. You will see the progress. Join senior leaders on those. There should be a planned program that you can drop in. It will be, as a governor, the most joyous part of the job, because you'll see learning happening rather than necessarily being sat in a governing body meeting, which has to happen, but is the bureaucratic part of the job. Get on those programs to see what's happening and reassure yourself. Even as a layperson, if you're looking at examples of books from year 1 up to year 6, and you see the progress of what learners are doing, the stuff on the walls around school, the listening to those learners, you will get a feel as well. What leaders tell you about that as well, you will get a feel for a good school and what is going on, far better than we've got 90% level 4s. The challenge, and this goes back to one of the questions earlier, is how you then convey that to the wider community. I think, again, newsletters, videos that are available on the website of Learning Happening is more powerful how you communicate than some of the data that we used to use. Okay. There is, and this is a real priority for our schools at the moment, you will see it in the news, quite a bit in Wales, but attendance post-pandemic is still a significant challenge for many of our learners. And it is one of the data, the raw data, that is really been included. This is a chart that there used to be loads of them in the packs on every metric, but I've included it for attendance because what they do, every school is grouped with similar schools. They're grouped in 5 groups for primary school, and then their scores on attendance, not scores, percentage of half-day sessions attended are included. This is quite a legacy one, but you'll see the blue line is the school. The blue line here is achieving about 92% attendance. You'll see it's stuck back there in 2009-10 between a black and a red line. What that means is in the second quarter. So all the schools in this group would be listed together, lumped together in order, and you take the top quarter, the second quarter, the third quarter, and the fourth quarter. So if you're above the black line, you're in the top quarter. If you're in between the black and the red, you're in the second benchmark quarter, hence the 2 above. And you can see this school stays in 2, but then in 2011-12, it drops below the red line, but it's not as low as the yellow. Therefore, it's in the third quarter. Yeah. Then 2012-13, it's gone up to the second quarter again. But a bit of caution here. Can you see how close to the black dot it is? It's nearly in the top quarter. So the numbers 2, 2, 3, 2, 1, 1, 3 don't tell you as much as seeing the progress compared with similar schools outlaid on that graph. Look out for those. The attendance packs are usually published January. I would hope those attendance packs are shared with you as governors so that you can get a sight of them. They don't look quite like that anymore, but they will be available shortly. So ask questions about those. It's a little pack that's available. Do we have our attendance data yet? It should be in the head teacher report as well. So, summary of what the role. It's an understanding that this is a summary of the whole thing now. So quarter to 6, as I predicted, discussion with school leaders and understanding the data's changed down to the school, working with the cluster to determine progression assessment in line with Curriculum for Wales. There's some questions there, just 5. I don't expect you to go into a governing body and read them off one by one, but you may want to consider the right time when you're looking at data, or if you're on the teaching and learning committee, how is the school planning for assessment as part of Curriculum for Wales? Have you had a presentation on that yet from governors, as governors from the school leadership? What information can the school share with you on progress of year groups, learners, groups of learners? When does the school undertake personalised assessments? What of those results of those outcomes from personalised assessments tell us? And also, how can what assessment tells us inform the school development plan? Are just 5 high-level questions to consider for governors. It does put more onus on you. However, there's also your school improvement partner as well. some point in the year, you should have a visit, particularly if there are concerns, but it's the majority of our schools who have a visit from a school improvement partner who works for us, but is usually a highly experienced head in another school who will have observed what's happening, who will have talked to the head, who will be developing, and will also tell you their view of it as well in terms of what's happening within school as an outside view.